philosophical method is asking questions about the present moment and just starting with the present moment. Okay, what is the case? What is real? How do we know it's real? And what is one-off? What is sometimes? What is always? And getting into an understanding of what does not change, what does change, why are things happening. You see that series of questions that can get quite methodical in the present moment, but it can also just be one question about why is the world the way it is. Okay? So sometimes when we think of the question, why is the world the way it is, we think of more creative things where you have, why are all the categories that we know in our life the way they are? Why are we not living on floating clouds, for example? Rearranging categories like that is one way of asking why do we perceive what we perceive, but at a much deeper level, it's more so why do our five senses all feed into one perception that we have, and why do we have ideas about our perceptions, and how do we see what's verifiable in our ideas? Okay, this leads into a big debate in the world of philosophy, which is where do you start? Okay, depending on where you start completely determines the rest of the conversation, the rest of the experience, the rest of the process. So where do you start? There seems to be different camps. There's some people who say, like the Pre-Socratics, you start with the world. And starting with the world leads to certain things. Cause and effect. Why are cause and effect happening the way they do? Then you get things like correlation, connection, coincidence. Those are my big 4 C's. There's cause, there's correlation, there's connection, there's coincidence. Whenever somebody says, oh, well, correlation does not equal causation, I respond, it doesn't mean coincidence either. Correlation is a relationship that influences each other. That aside, that all flows from starting with the world. Whereas other people start with the person and the perception, okay? And they both have their pros and cons, and a third thing is sometimes presented to bridge the two, okay? So starting with the world is sometimes described as starting with ontology. Ontology is the study of being, okay? And starting with perception or the person is sometimes treated as epistemology, the study of truth, the study of perception. And in one direction, you have people saying, well, we're in this world, the world precedes us, that's why we should start with the world. Other people then say, is there anything you know that you don't know because you're perceiving it? Okay? And from that objection, you know everything you know because you're perceiving it. Let's start with the perception and not with the world. You have the counterpoint to that being, well, if it's all in your perception, and some people say it's all in your mind, if it's all in your mind, why are your thoughts not changing the world around you? If it was truly all in the mind, your thoughts would be able, logically speaking, to change what's around you if it's quote-unquote all in your head. Then when it comes to the world, if it's all in the world, it raises questions about all the thoughts we have that don't seem to connect to the world. Okay, so I'm saying this sort of issue because I propose that metaphysics, the idea of finding what's beyond, what's prior to, what's the summary of the world around us, trying to find things that kind of at least come before the analysis of the world or of the person, can help us find the bridge between different states of experience in the world and with people. And so I kind of start with metaphysics, ontology, epistemology. They need to be a triangle, a trinity of sorts at the same time. You're not starting just with a perception, you're not starting just with the world, and you're not starting with a metaphysical principle that you haven't been able to demonstrate through any means whatsoever. So that's going to be our starting point. If you have a difference on that, as I say, we welcome differences. Explain what you think a better starting point could be. Okay, so you'll see in the reading, you're kind of giving a gut reaction to the monists of the pre-Socratic world, the pluralists, and the Pythagoreans. That's what takes us through pre-Socratic and then into the classical antiquity, the golden age. That's when we get guys like Socrates Plato and Aristotle. We haven't even touched time yet. As I say, we are completely in analysis of the present moment. Why is the world the way it is? That's where we're at. We haven't even added in the whole reality of before, after, past, present, future. How does that affect things? We find later generations deal with that. Okay? So we saw the first philosophers using this method are the Milesians. Sometimes it's called the Ionian school. All right? It's mainly Thales, I believe Anaximander and Anaxagoras, or Anaximenes. There's a few of the Anax guys. The first few, they departed from practical and mythological traditions by seeking for a single principle from which reality comes. So whether it's your experience of the world right now or any notion of reality, saying that it comes from a single principle and not from many things is monist, okay? Single principle to many, not many into one. Many into one would be pluralist. And regardless of what you think of the fact that Thales and Anaximenes and other Milesians, they all had an idea for a first principle being something either physical, one of the four elements, fire, water, air, earth, or an ether, a substance kind of bridging the physical and the non-physical. Regardless of what you think of those theories, which they came to with what they had available to them at the time, there are things that come out of their pursuits that we still use in philosophy today. And same with the subsequent monists, who we call the Eliatic school, same with the pluralists who disagreed with them, same with the Pythagoreans who had their new take disagreeing with both, and same with the Atomists who sort of were the last pluralists before Socrates came onto the scene. Okay, so we're going to go through the main principles that you can get from those philosophers and philosophies. Regardless of whether you accept their whole metaphysics, you can take certain principles they used that are still valid to use in other proposals and other arguments. Okay, so for the early Milesians, it was universals, first principles, and prime matter. Okay, from the Eliatics, we get key principles of something from something and nothing from nothing. Okay, the principle something comes from something, nothing comes from nothing. Really understanding what that means is still used by everybody, you could argue, who just, even in ordinary life, when we talk and we have assumptions of cause and effect, we're kind of saying something comes from something. There's a connection between the first something and a subsequent something, and you explore the connection that explains for a change you can see. And nothing truly is nothing. It's a complete absolute negation. It's not some sort of, lesser something that we can treat as ether or quantum particles. It's truly non-existent. All right. Then from the pluralists, we get understandings or principles of mind being a unique category with questions of whether mind is in matter in the physical world or separate from matter. Okay. Questions of consciousness and how beings connect to each other, with an answer being right there before you talk about the connections between beings. Is the mind separate from a person or from matter or from the world, or is anything we call intelligence integrated into matter? Big thing the pluralists were talking about, and we still talk about it today. Okay, what is the mind becomes a question for later eras. A lot of people go with the mind being a rational capacity that people have, rational capacity for intellect, for will to make decisions, imagination and memory. And sort of in imagination and memory, the intellect can assign value and make distinctions and think of things that are not immediately there. These things are sort of treated as the mind for humans, and yet the pluralists, when they talk about mind or nous is the psyche in Greek, they're talking sometimes about things simpler than what I just said. Sometimes they're talking about things much greater. So you got to read into the pluralists to really get that. Then from Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, we get the concept of unity and diversity held together in connection with the primacy of patterns in the reality we live in. Okay, so sort of like the trifecta, the trinity of unity, diversity, they're held together in a connection. That's a Pythagorean insight. And then the fact that you see patterns everywhere you go, and repeating patterns help us really go deeper in life and maximize things when we see what the patterns are. Those are Pythagorean contributions. Okay, patterns in the stars, in the movement of all bodies, weather patterns, patterns of life cycles, they all have a symmetry with patterns of speech, patterns of logic, patterns of math, architecture, music, and the arts. This incredible connection between the sciences and the arts is found in the philosophy of Pythagoras, even though his cosmology of how the universe came to be and certain other parts of his worldview we've forgotten and or we don't take it that seriously anymore, he still came up with some great insights that we still use about patterns, and you'll hear about them obviously with triangles in math class. That's kind of a big deal. All right, after the Pythagoreans, the Atomists took the pluralist arguments and put them in a materialist direction. So a big thing to get out of the Atomists is that they're the first materialists or the first atheists, you could say. Materialist is the belief that anything that exists is ultimately physical matter, and there's nothing beyond that, okay? We get hints of an opposed immaterial view coming out of monists like Heraclitus and even other pluralists like Anaxagoras. That's why pluralist and atomist are two separate things, even though every atomist is technically being a pluralist. Not every pluralist is an atomist. And from Heraclitus and Anaxagoras, other guys, we get this sense of an immaterial reality, which is sort of opposed to the atomist argument of everything being material, okay? It is in classical antiquity or the golden age of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that the immaterial view is refined in debates that they had with the atomists. The immaterial view, simply put, is that there are real things with no matter to them, yet having substance and affecting reality. So if something is real, it has substance, it's affecting reality, then, and it's not material, then the substance would be spirit. And this is where we get the term spiritual from, okay? It's a layman's term for immaterial. The academic term is immaterial. The ordinary life term is spiritual. Spirit comes from terms in old languages, bit of Greek, bit of Latin, bit of Hebrew, different languages. Spirit means breath or life breath, breath of life, or wind. And it's similar to how the most common analogy for a spiritual worldview is that in ordinary life, the wind is invisible, yet it affects and drives everything else. Okay, that's why spire has a common root with spirit and with the wind and with breath. Now we'll go through each of the understandings or principles discovered that influence all subsequent generations, regardless of the whole theory, as we said, and we'll go in the progression I just laid out. I'll give you a few details for each principle, and then we'll wrap it up and we'll go into our assignment. So, the reality of universals. Early people practicing philosophy saw that an intelligible unity and oneness is needed for any diversity or quantity to be perceived to begin with, or to persist in existence. To sort of hash that out, think of how anything, a thing of any sort, stops being that thing when it loses its unity. And especially when the parts of anything that form a whole lose their unity. Think about, the parts of you, the parts of anything you encounter, a table, a house, a plant, losing their unity and losing the parts' unity as well. The images people think of are either going invisible, becoming a sludge, falling apart into dirt or into particles. Like, you would stop perceiving anything once the whole or the parts lose their unity, and that seems to connect to our unity of perception. We see things as one and not as 5 different worlds through 5 different senses. If you could actually access a different world through every sense, you would be very overwhelmed. It would be terrifying. All right. Okay, a connection between unity and diversity, and a perfection in discovering the harmony of that connection, thus finding that there's certain universals inside the unity of perception that transfer across multiple situations. The phrase philosophic language gets at this notion of unity and universals in how we perceive, and once we start talking about universals, we're using philosophic or philosophical language. And it's just language that is both general and specific at the same time, and that shows a comprehension of unity and diversity as universals themselves and in their connections forming different parts and wholes. Okay? All things have a part and a whole, different parts and a whole, and understanding differences and overlaps between parts and wholes brings us to philosophical language. Okay, so some examples. The parts and the whole of a table, the parts and the whole of a meal, and the parts and the whole of a business. Okay, you can see how a meal, a table, a business, there's separate parts leading to a whole that we call the meal, the table, the business, and they overlap if that business happens to be a restaurant. Language of concepts that can apply equally and differently to different particular situations while still being a unique concept. The quickest possible demonstration of philosophical language and universals is 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of whether it's apples or cars being counted. 2 + 2 is 4 is universal, and it's particular when you have 2 cars added to 2 cars or 2 apples added to 2 apples. We have similar things with concepts like healthy relationship or cause and effect or proper technique. Okay, healthy relationship between 2 high school friends might look different from a healthy relationship between parent and child or between 2 spouses. But in all those cases, we have the understanding that a healthy relationship is manifesting and not a toxic or unhealthy relationship. Cause and effect, when the motion of cars is being caused and the speed is an effect, we get its cause and effect, and we also get how it's still a matter of cause and effect when people have certain biological reactions to certain types of food or drink or stimulant, okay? Proper technique for being a car mechanic is still proper technique, even though the proper technique for being a doctor is very different. They both have proper technique unifying across the situations. That's what makes it a type of universal, okay? This can really help us in the reality of empathy and understanding suffering enough for a relationship to grow, even if we have not experienced the particular suffering. Viktor Frankl really crystallized this. You could argue Solzhenitsyn did as well. So Viktor Frankl, he was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was in Auschwitz, experienced horrible, horrible atrocities, horrible loss. He survived the genocide perpetrated by the Nazis. Solzhenitsyn, great figure who survived a genocide perpetrated by the Soviet Union against pretty much any dissident who resisted the Soviet Union. He was sent to a gulag. They came to different realizations about meaning from their experience, but Viktor Frankl really connects to this because as a Holocaust survivor and a therapist later on, people he gave therapy to were like, I guess I don't have any right to like complain about stuff because I'm not a Holocaust survivor. Like, you must get annoyed when you hear about my problems or about our marriage's problems. He was a couples therapist. And he said, no, like, I've experienced horrible pain, and you in your own way have experienced horrible pain. They're separate types of things, but we can trust through empathy that we know the experience of horrible pain to be transferring across different people. And because of that, we can empathize with each other. And it was kind of beautiful that Viktor Frankl just gave therapy to people in very different situations from being a Holocaust survivor. And it was because he sensed there is a universal to surviving pain and persevering through pain, and then coming into something new out of pain and sort of going from good to bad to perfect because of the journey he felt was a universal. The same way that the Pre-Socratics were getting at universals in simple understandings of the world around them. We'll learn in future lessons, Plato took this to the nth degree. Plato's theories of forms really gives a whole theory about what universals are and what they could point to about reality and about human nature. We'll get to that when we get to Plato. All right, for Heraclitus and many others, so there's the early Milesians, the early monists, then there's the first pluralist pushback, then there's Heraclitus, a later Milesian who sort of refines the monist reality comes from one principle argument. He refines it. And he refined it by saying that the ultimate universal is logos. Logos or logos, you'll see in the reading, it has over 150 different meanings, but intelligibility, meaning, and unity of perception are high on the order of definitions for it. So in this lecture, I'll emphasize that logos places intelligibility itself or understanding itself as the essence or the base of reality. The way that what works in the world of beauty and art and engineering and math and science and communication, the way they all align, there's certain forms and techniques to what works in human endeavors. are an example of logos for Heraclitus and other early philosophers, that basically the starting point is meaning, is intelligibility, and everything participates in the deeper meaning, the deeper intelligibility. The obvious follow-up question to that is like, is meaning simply a general description of the how, or is there anything more specific to meaning? Is there a final meaning? We'll explore that later in the course. But yeah, Heraclitus saw a world where everything is in constant flux. Logos is the simple answer for many to the question, why do we perceive and understand anything at all to begin with, rather than writhing through distortion akin to a broken radio feed or worms in the earth? Why do we perceive things? Why is it intelligible? Well, there's something deeper called logos for many people following in the footsteps of philosophy. It is also part of why our reality is the way it is in logical sequences from what is to what is in a different way, that the philosophical method of page 1 in your reading delineates. Okay, that kind of ties into logos. All right, there is a sequence of making truth sort of valid and making our observations connect to each other. Okay, logos is part of why reality is not a reorganization of things we encounter that we can think of in the imagination. One example of that is we know things in our world through contrast, through difference, and through contact, or the lack of contact. Okay, contrast and contact are how we really gain knowledge. People can imagine, we see it in stories, a world where people know intuitively the inner essence of everything. But in the world we live in, that's not the case. And for some reason, the experience part, you have to learn by experience, that's part of logos. All right, this understanding of logos was exemplified for Heraclitus and others in the famous statement that it is impossible to just step in the same river twice. Consider how when you stare at the same part of a river, a set motion is repeating in perfect frequency and predictability. Yet every small trickling wave of water never repeats. The assembly of small details is always changing. You see it in the waterfalls by Owen Sound as well. Yet it's always changing within a broader pattern that never changes. The image of fire accomplishes the same pattern of constant change and constant stillness balanced together in a dynamic whole. All right, waterfalls, rivers, fire, get at this balance of stillness and change and connection, and somehow participating in that, for Heraclitus, that was logos. Since then, it's been Plato, really crystallized part of the logos understanding and sort of saying that there's a physical reality and a non-physical reality connected. Plato did part of it, Aristotle did another part of it, and since then, common faith traditions have really expounded upon that particular worldview. So it could be Jewish faith, Christian faith, Islamic, Zoroastrian, Hindu, among others, crystallize the idea that abstract universals we all use are part of a substance without matter called spirit. We'll come back to that in a bit. Today we hear terms like mind or psyche, yet the most detailed neuroscience, regardless of the terms, considers the origin of consciousness with abstract ideas to be a mystery. Meat computer theories haven't really panned out in the research so far. We can discuss this debate. We'll probably have it multiple times throughout the course. Any abstraction that has real evidence in the world and seems to influence us, what is its true nature? That will come into our tutorials. All right, the second concept from the early Milesians is first principle in terms of logic. A first principle, it can also be an axiom or a basic assumption. It's a starting point that cannot be further rationalized with because of statements. It is either accepted or rejected, and doing so is necessary for observation, comprehension, dialogue to happen in any way. So one example, existence is that which is real. Okay, different truth theories. Another one is that that which is true is that which conforms to reality, or the alignment of senses to reality, to observable records. Different truth theories boil down to first principles that you have to kind of accept the possibility before you really debate or discuss it. Okay, if you deny that we exist and can communicate, you are denying conversation about it. Using that denial as a counterpoint to an argument you don't like is self-contradictory. All right, if If there's no way to know, or if nothing's true, then we can say that what you just said was probably not true, and let's not listen. Okay, it kind of turns in on itself. It becomes contradictory, which is why it seems to be a valid first principle. Something exists or does not exist, and we start from notions of what truly is real. Another first principle from logic, one that comes up a lot in philosophy, is non-contradiction. Okay, so the principle of non-contradiction is that a thing cannot be or not be in the same way at the same time. I'll say that again. A thing cannot be and not be in the same way at the same time. Another way of saying it is that two different things that are mutually exclusive in their properties and nature cannot be the same thing. Because yeah, you would be and not be if you were trying to do that. Okay, and to be and to not be at the same time is just, it collapses into nothingness. Something is or is not. And then you get into the same way at the same time to sort of account for changes. Okay, a big issue that we'll see coming up frequently throughout philosophy is issues of essence and identity and change. Okay, some say that essences, so an identity that's distinct from every other identity, that's how you know what it is. The essence of a pencil is different from the essence of an airplane. Okay, we have certain things that form an essence and they're distinct from every other essence. Okay, essence and identity can be synonyms for each other. Some say that these essences are fixed, okay, unchanging. But then others point out that we see all sorts of things that seem to have an essence and then they change somehow into having no essence or into having a totally different essence. And people take that to an extreme to say, well, there is no such thing as essence. Everything is kind of just part of the same big flux, okay? But then in turn, you know those changed essences because of a fixed identity concept in your mind anyway. So the principle of non-contradiction resolves that kind of feedback loop. Okay, there are fixed essences, they can change. We know what they are because they cannot be two mutually exclusive things in the exact same way at the exact same time. So even if it's going through change, we know that the change is a unique thing that is happening and the opposite of that change is not happening. The third major concept to arise from what is now called the Milesian school is prime matter. You'll see in the reading how Anaximander crystallized this last concept by accident while developing his own theory. Talk about prime matter. Prime matter is just the basic stuff that we start with. And most schools have an idea of a simple starting point that is undelineated stuff, and that's prime matter. Okay, we'll see if that's valid or not. You'll all have opinions on that. All right. So Anaximander, his prime matter, the first example of prime matter was the apeiron, or the apeiron, that Anaximander proposed as a mixed boundary of sorts between physical world and some higher dimension. Okay, half physical, half immaterial for Anaximander, but for Heraclitus with Logos, he made it totally immaterial. He thinks the intelligence, whatever that intelligence is strictly immaterial. Okay, closest visuals to this emerging understanding of universals, first principles, and how prime matter plays into that, but particularly universals and metaphysics, the visuals that help us explore this are anything where there's translucent objects, where they're overlapping, some are more pronounced, some are colorful and beautiful, while others are more dim and distorted. Okay, images where harmony of balance between all the images in the translucence is greater than the sum of the parts of these images. Okay, examples, paintings of the last canto from Dante's Divine Comedy, various Hindu arts, especially carpets and painting, accomplish this type of mystical image that kind of gets at the understanding of metaphysics. Cloisters of any form or advanced gardening does this as well. If you look up cloister garden or the gardens of Versailles in France, very organized types of gardens that have nice architecture around them, they get at this idea of a translucence where many things come into one. Okay, natural and man-made water fountains or waterfalls with big vista surroundings, they get at it too. Any place where epic architecture mixes with rare expanses of natural beauty, sort of nature and culture combined, does this well. And there are examples across all cultures. Architecture in advanced places of worship or capital cities and legislatures of nations attempt this as well. Think about how a Gothic cathedral, and certain legislatures, especially in Westminster countries like Britain, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, India, they look similar, okay? The Gothic cathedral and the Westminster legislature have similar architecture, whereas the Greco-Roman arena and gymnasium is pretty much the same design as the legislature in republics like France, Ireland, South Africa, and America. Various parts of Latin America too. Some people think that that gets at competing understandings of a type of government that's more hierarchical, is going to have more Gothic architecture, and sort of like the wider pillar-based Greco-Roman is anyone trying to get at more of an egalitarian political system. Okay, but they're examples of, you know, real experiences where different parts come into a whole and there's a universal going across many situations and they tie into beauty and they really move people's inner lives. You probably get this when you're in nature or listening to music, and I hope to learn, you know, what really gives you a sense of the transcendent, what transcends many situations, possibly all reality, for you personally. That'll be a fun conversation in this class. Okay? We'll just restate what the Eliatics and the Pluralists and the Atomists were about, and then we'll have one observation about how their dialogues leading into the Golden Age can help you in the year 2024. All right, so the principles from the Eliatics, the later monist school of Milesians, that something comes from something and nothing comes from nothing. Okay, those principles, as well as atomist metaphysics, they're plainly described in the reading, and it should be sufficient for us to stick with that. We'll just quickly restate them before finishing, as I say. So basically for the Eliatics, nothing is so truly nothing that any argument treating the term nothing as a state from which things come from and go to is false, because if it's actually nothing, it's impossible for anything to come from nothing or go to nothing. Okay, if you're calling nothing a something, it violates the basic non-contradiction that we were talking about. An eternal universe, or a universe with a starting point, gets at this issue of how do things really happen if nothing is truly nothing. Aristotle was into the eternal universe. The medieval schools that were very into Aristotle were very different in saying, no, there's a starting point, and it's the creator who works on the starting point. All right, that's one example of how the idea of something from something and nothing from nothing continued to play out over thousands of years. All right, then you have the atomists. They take a plural starting point to the cosmos and build on it to argue that only material things that we can describe as atoms with quantum mechanics, I guess, if you wanted to super update it, would truly exist. Then the Pythagoreans, following Pythagoras, point out that patterns are innate universals transferring to every part of life. And in Logos and metaphysics, we already got at that, but you can thank Pythagoras for making the connection of these patterns between the world of beauty and the world of science. All right? Pluralist observations on what they called the appearance of change, because they thought change wasn't really happening. Some of them thought change was not really happening. On what the mind really is, those pluralist observations combined with the Pythagorean take on patterns to lead to some observations. We're going to go deeper on Empedocles to make this observation, okay? And the observation is that the categories these Pre-Socratics are working with make the choice of whether mind or matter are separate or ingrained. They make that choice a necessary starting point before you can talk about other issues, okay? And that leads to the idea throughout philosophy that a small change in the beginning leads to gigantic changes later on, okay? We'll demonstrate this, as I say, with Empedocles' schema. It really shows how severe resulting differences in worldview and behavior can be following how one defines abstract forces, for example. That's a small thing in the beginning. Empedocles, you'll see in the reading, grew on the pluralist ideas of Anaxagoras. Everything is everything, nothing comes into being or out of being, everything is in everything, I mean. And he grew on them to say that love and strife were both the driving forces of reality, and that within the pluralist metaphysics, love and strife had to be real physical things. Okay, so it did mirror a lot of mythologies that sort of had order and chaos as the primal states of being. And whether love is shared affirmation, shared pleasure, the free gift of self to the other, or a mutual self-gift, there's tons of different meanings of love. We'll learn about that later in class. Same with strife. Strife can mean conflict between, disorder within, or any form of destruction and death or coming apart. And regardless, there's a choice about whether love and strife, these abstract concepts, whether they're real and how they're real if they are. So Empedocles said that love and strife are real and that they were as material as any object of physical touch. Okay? Because everything had to be material and there was more than one starting point, and somehow they were coming into the world that we experience. And that's what Empedocles said. What he said, that they're real and that they're physical, that's one of 4 logical options. Okay? Love, strife, harmony, beauty, goodness, justice, more, any abstract concept can be real and material, like Empedocles said. It could be real and immaterial, or spiritual, which is what Plato and Aristotle started to get at. They can be imaginary and helpful, so not real, but helpful, or imaginary and unhelpful. All right? Not real, but not even helpful either. Okay? Think of how you've never touched a centimeter, but its essence in your mind helps us build shelter. That would be an example of imaginary but helpful, and it refers to other things that are real. There are no other possible categories than what I've laid out. If you think you can prove me wrong, that's awesome. Please include it in your submission this week. But by choosing real and material out of those 4 options, Empedocles and others are faced with a universe where these forces are physical and mechanical, completing themselves, being coming together, which is love, or coming apart in strife. Okay? In this universe, the only choice for us would be to join these forces or oppose them. We could avoid them, but that probably just leads to a worse coming apart, a worse type of strife. Okay? The other 3 categories, real and immaterial or spiritual, not real but helpful, not real but also not helpful, arguably allow for more choices from a person in how the abstract goods and desires of life manifest in reality. The pluralists, especially Empedocles and Anaxagoras, probably most of the atomists as well, they would reply that other choices that the 3 other options claim to give you can ultimately be broken down into coming together, which they call love, and falling apart, which they call strife. Then others would push back against those people, saying, well, no, the other options are truly different, and you need to know your actual options before you judge them. You can't be hasty in your judgment of your options in life. Okay, so the nature of the highest abstractions, ideas or ideals, will always be a philosophical question people face. It drives the period of critics and romantics from Hume to Hegel in the modern era, for example. We'll learn about that later on. The point we're getting at here, however, is that even within the narrow confines of one first principle on the nature of ideals given to us by Empedocles, there is still an entire world of differences following that principle. With the idea of abstract forces being real, material, and mechanical forces following a set pattern to completion or coming apart, one can see some belief systems following that first principle that are very positive. You have Taoism, Taoist, you have Sikh, you have certain schools of Hindu and Buddhist life and thought that believe in that you have some instantiation of the immaterial forces in matter, ingrained with matter. And they've given us lots of contributions in art, medicine, psychology. Yet one can also see in history examples of following this idea of like an abstract ideal must have physical reality that are very negative. Things like 19th century race science, the eugenics movement, ultimately National Socialism, aka Nazis. We see with those examples how cruelties and absurdities can be pushed from the premise that abstract ideals must have a physical incarnation. All right, in those negative examples, it was things like good health, fullness of being, and purity getting mixed with biological substances, be it genes or the blood, and it led to atrocities and catastrophes that you read about in history. Okay, so contrasts between very positive and very negative coming from one first principle, of which we've seen at least 3 alternatives about the nature of ideals and abstract ideas and abstract reality. Those contrasts show us a lot, okay, that one principle leads to a bunch of contrasts, and then there's other principles on the same issue leading to more contrasts. How you navigate such a diverse world is where Plato and Aristotle come in with both the forms from Plato and schools of logic from Aristotle that we still use today. Again, regardless of wherever you take their whole worldview, you can take the forms and logic and navigate these extremes. All right, we'll leave off there, hopefully having shown that the very first philosophers gave us some concepts still in use today, and that first principles may start with a binary, but give us a world of multiple options and rearranging coalitions based on what is at stake. What issue are you talking about? You'll have some people agreeing and disagreeing, but then change the issue. The people who agree and disagree totally realign depending on what's at stake. Hopefully that allows us to bypass false dichotomies that are presented to us today in 2024 and get to simple yes-no propositions about principles, and then let coalitions, arise in real life. Letting principles be the matter of yes-no binary, but letting the manifestation in the real world be one of many options. All right, thanks a lot. Let's get into the discussion. Hopefully you'll do that Tuesday, Wednesday, or Wednesday, Thursday. The reading is about 12 or 14 pages this week. Figure out how you best read, go through it, and make sure you have your reflection in by midnight Sunday. All right, thanks a lot.